Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here as part of this speaker series. As you just heard, in 1993, I wrote a book with my colleague Nancy Denton called American Apartheid. It was really a treatise on how segregation came into existence in the United States in the course of the 20th century. Black-white segregation is not something that just happened naturally. It was deliberately created by a series of private actions and public policies and institutionalized practices and behaviors. And over the course of the 20th century, levels of black segregation rose in cities throughout the United States until the black ghetto became a standard part of the configuration of US metropolitan areas. That was published in 1993, and I'm currently at work on a book called American Apartheid 2.1. Whereas American Apartheid was 2.0 the 20th century, this is 2.1 the 21st century. So what are the arguments that I made in American Apartheid? Well, I wanted to talk about why segregation matters. As I said, segregation doesn't just happen. It's deliberately manufactured through public and private actions intended to preserve privilege. Segregation stifles socioeconomic mobility. In the United States, social mobility and spatial mobility have always been closely related. If you look at what groups, immigrant groups coming into the United States have done over time, they've come in and moved into poor neighborhoods and cities. They've worked hard, moved up the economic ladder. Once they move a little bit up the economic ladder, they buy into a better neighborhood to put themselves up a rung on the residential ladder. And by being in a better neighborhood, they put themselves in a better position to advance further and to pass on their benefits to their children. Because of segregation, this process of social and spatial mobility serving in a mutually reinforcing pattern to ratchet people up the socioeconomic ladder was all but closed to African Americans. Segregation levels in American cities were so high that this was virtually impossible. Segregation was enforced by practices institutionalized at all levels in American life. It was imposed by public policies, by the federal government. The Federal Housing Administration in its original legislation in 1932 mandated that FHA loans could not go to African Americans and could not go to black neighborhoods. Therefore, and it was also biased against urban housing. Wasn't applicable to row houses, attached houses, apartment houses, condos, anything in a building that was not a single family dwelling. It pushed all the housing demand out of the central cities into the suburbs and forbade blacks from following that route, giving us our well-known configuration of white suburbs and black central cities, which became the norm by 1970. A lot has changed now. Income inequality has risen. Racial segregation has persisted. Class segregation is rising. And so one of the things I want to do in this book is update, moving the data from 1990 to 2010 or maybe 2015. So segregation stifles socioeconomic mobility by blocking spatial mobility. Segregation also acts to concentrate poverty. And this was an insight by my colleague from the University of Chicago, William Julius Wilson, who began to pay attention to what was going on in Black America in the 1970s and 1980s. And he noticed that in the wake of the post-industrial transformation of the economic structure of American cities, that poverty rates in black neighborhoods were rising quite rapidly and often to extreme levels. So sociologists have always paid a lot of attention to the poor, but I think they underpay attention to the affluent and the wealthy. And it behooves us to look at both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. So later on in this lecture, I will talk about not only the concentration of poverty, but also the concentration of affluence. And both are brought about by racial and class segregation. So segregation concentrates poverty and creates a very disadvantaged neighborhood that is routinely inflicted on African Americans in this society. No other group in the United States experiences the high levels of neighborhood poverty that are typical in urban black communities. By living in a poor neighborhood, you live in a neighborhood where things that are correlated with poverty also get concentrated in addition to poverty. So you concentrate welfare dependency, you concentrate delinquency, you concentrate unwed parenthood, you concentrate a lack of social control, and you build very disadvantaged environments. And recent work by people like Pat Sharkey at NYU and Robert Sampson at Harvard University have really shown pretty conclusively that neighborhoods are now the most important nexus for the transmission of poverty and disadvantage across the generations and within the life cycle. And what they didn't say in this book, but which I think is quite important, is it's also the nexus for the passing of advantage across generations and in the life cycle. Fourth reason why segregation matters is that it makes discrimination and exploitation easy and efficient. If you don't like a social group of people and you want to exclude them from participation in society and exploit them, it's very convenient to have them all located in one place. Then by cutting off resources to a place, you cut off resources to a people. And that's exactly what happened in the course of the housing crisis that occurred in the 1990s and 2000s and came to a head in 2008. Black neighborhoods were systematically targeted for exploitation by financial institutions, for predatory lending. And wealth, as a consequence, was systematically stripped out of black communities in the wake of the mortgage crisis. And this was all made possible and facilitated simply because black neighborhoods were easy to find. Black neighborhoods had been discriminated against through redlining in prior years and had very little financial sophistication because they hadn't received any loans and had nobody paying attention to them. And suddenly they became very valuable as targets for mortgage-backed securities. And they were specifically targeted and they're peddled, even if they qualified for conventional loans, they were pushed into subprime loans. And then when the bubble burst, their wealth basically evaporated into the pockets of people in Wall Street. So segregation makes discrimination and exploitation easy and efficient. And finally, segregation isolates the disadvantaged socially and hobbles their ability to protect themselves politically. You can form a black district that elects a black representative, but if it's isolated all by itself, it doesn't share common interests, overlapping interests with other people. And again, it makes it easy within the political system to exploit by just not targeting resources to a black neighborhood or a black city or a black neighbor or a black area. And the Republicans have figured this out, and they have gerrymandered congressional districts to create black districts, which is another way of saying they're creating white districts elsewhere that are isolated and guaranteed to be Republican Party strongholds. So let me go through what's happened to segregation in the United States since the 1990s. Actually, I'm going to go clear back to 1970, because one of the things that's happened since then, back when I was doing work for American Apartheid, I had to use things called census tapes, where you had to have a tape operator put a tape on a computer, and then you'd sometimes put your card deck into a reader, and then you'd wait to see whether the card reader worked, and then if that worked, then you wait to see if your program worked, and then if a program worked, then somebody would mount the tape, and then if everything went well, you get some output a few hours later. I know this is the dark ages for most of you, but this is what it was like, and it took us 2 to 3 years to prepare a simple data file for 60 metropolitan areas. Now, of course, you can buy a digital data set online from a variety of vendors that give you census tract information from 1970 to 2010, and it's cheap and easy to use. So what I'm reporting now are data on 287 different metropolitan areas across the United States. So here's what we observe with trends in racial segregation. using a standard segregation index known as the dissimilarity index that varies from 0 to 100, where 100 is total segregation, where for blacks and whites, for example, don't share any neighborhoods in common. And 0 would mean when there's a completely even distribution where blacks and whites are in the same proportion across all neighborhoods. And as you can see, there has been some progress. The top line shows a degree of black-white segregation as measured by this index. And in 1970, it was very high, with an average of about 78, which is an extreme level of segregation that no other group has really ever experienced in the course of American history. Thereafter, and remember, the key date is that in 1968, the Fair Housing Act passed, and it, for the first time outlawed discrimination in the rental and sale of housing. So after 1968, after 1970, levels of black-white segregation did go down at about 5 points per decade, reaching a level of about 60 in 2010. And this is a weighted average, so it gives you the experience of the average black metropolitan resident. And so the average black metropolitan resident in 2010 lived in a neighborhood that was 60% black. This 60 lived under conditions with an index of 60. And this is typically considered to be a high level of segregation. If you look at the Hispanic and Asian lines, you see that they stayed fairly flat, edged up a bit, which in some ways is good given the rapid growth of those populations. But when we look at levels of isolation within neighborhoods, the degree to which people live in neighborhoods with only members of their same group, we see a somewhat different picture. You see, as before, the degree of black isolation within neighborhoods falls over time at a fairly constant rate. But at the same time, because of the rapid growth of the Latino population, levels of Hispanic spatial isolation rise very, very rapidly in contrast. So back in 1970, the average African American lived in a neighborhood that was 65% black, and the average Hispanic lived in a neighborhood that was only 25% black. Over time, those two lines have converged, and now the average African American and average Latino lives in a neighborhood that's about 48% composed of their own group members. And as you can see, Asians are not very isolated at all. Now, we talk about segregation, and we always refer to minority segregation. But in fact, the most segregated group in America is white people. And this looks at neighborhood isolation from the viewpoint of whites. And the top line shows the level of white neighborhood isolation. Back in 1970, the average white person in metropolitan America lived in a neighborhood that was 90% white. This also fell, but at a much slower pace. And as of 2010, the average white person, despite all the rapid demographic change throughout the country, lives in a neighborhood that was 75% black, 75% white. So white Americans still live in overwhelmingly white neighborhoods. Part of the process of spatial integration in this country has involved suburbanization. But as I illustrated at the outset of my remarks, black Americans didn't have access to the suburbs for most of the post-war period, and they lag far behind in their levels of suburbanization. So in 1970, about 50% of whites lived in suburbs, and that rose steadily to about 65% by the year 2010. In 1970, only about 18% of African Americans lived in suburbs, and that's risen slowly now towards about 40%, but they still lag behind other groups. As you can see, whites are by far more suburbanized than anyone else. And what's segregation like in suburbs? This is segregation from whites in suburbs, and as you can see, segregation levels are somewhat lower, but African Americans are still quite segregated. They're the top line. And Asians are still the least segregated. So that we see strong differentials. And when we look at racial isolation in suburbs, we see that whites are very isolated in suburban areas. They're isolated in neighborhoods that are 80% white. down from about 96% white in 1970. Hispanics have risen the most in terms of racial isolation, as they have overall, and it's also true in suburbs. African Americans have remained fairly constant, as have Asians. One thing we know is that rising income doesn't necessarily bring about integration for African Americans. We see three graphs here showing levels of segregation by income, going from the lowest income quintile to the highest income quintile. In the top quintile, in the top panel, you see Asians. They started a relatively high level of segregation at the bottom quintile, and then they could drop down over time as income rises and over time. Hispanics show the same pattern, but African Americans start at much higher levels of segregation, and their levels of segregation do not change that much as income rises. The top two lines in the black panel showed data for 1980 and 1970 and 1980, and in those years, income had no effect on the level of segregation. It was only in 1990 when income began to have an effect on levels of black-white segregation. And still, if you look at the pattern, the number for 2010 for African Americans, you see that even the most affluent African Americans are still quite segregated with an index of dissimilarity of 60. And if you look at Hispanics, you see that this is where the lowest income Hispanics are. So basically, the most affluent African Americans end up at the place where Hispanics start the process of integration in the lowest economic quintile. You can also see this with levels of spatial probability of interaction with white people. So these are contact probabilities. Asians have contact probabilities above 50% with white people. Hispanics have contact probabilities above 50% with white people, and blacks do not have contact probabilities above 50%. Their contact probabilities are still quite low. Now, segregation, the black trend in segregation did decline over time, as I showed at the outset. But that really reflects two different trends. On the one hand, a certain set of metropolitan areas that contain relatively small numbers of African Americans and are characterized by certain other traits have actually desegregated quite rapidly. At the same time, however, another subset of metropolitan areas that include the largest black communities in the United States have remained stubbornly stuck at extremely high levels of segregation with no sign of declining. In our book, and in our work in the 1980s, early 1990s, Nancy Denton and I coined the term hypersegregation to refer to an unusually intense pattern of segregation across multiple geographic dimensions simultaneously. And we measured hypersegregation and found that in a subset of metropolitan areas, African Americans were hypersegregated along all these dimensions at the same time. In a recent study, we looked at what's happened to hypersegregation over time. The dashed line at the bottom shows the number of metropolitan areas in which African Americans are hypersegregated. So there were 40 hypersegregated metropolitan areas in 1970, and by 2010 it had been about cut in half to about 21. But within neighborhoods that were defined as hypersegregated, the index of dissimilarity remained extremely high. So in these hypersegregated cities, there's virtually no shift towards integration. And if you look at the black urban population overall, this is the distribution of exposure to different kinds of segregation. Hypersegregation 5 is highly segregated on 5 dimensions, geographic dimensions, and hypersegregated 4 is segregated on 4 geographic dimensions at the same time. So you see that about a third of all African Americans in cities today are hypersegregated in one way or another. Another 21% only suffer from high segregation with dissimilarity indices above 60. And about 46% experience moderate segregation with dissimilarity indices between 30 and 60. Very, very few experience low levels of segregation. And these are the most segregated cities in America. segregated across 5 dimensions simultaneously, showing here the index of dissimilarity and its trends over time. So you see that in Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Flint, Baltimore, Milwaukee, Birmingham, and St. Louis, levels of segregation have persisted at extremely high levels and show no real tendency in moving towards integration, and some have even moved up. These are all the metropolitan areas that are segregated on 4 dimensions at the same time. And you see here that levels of segregation are actually narrowing to a level in between 60 and 80, which is a very high index of dissimilarity, extremely high level of segregation. These are the areas where poverty is most concentrated, where the urban problems are most severe, and where poverty is most entrenched. As I said, when you look at the overall averages, you get an average between 2 experiences. These are the 5 most segregated cities in America and the 5 least segregated cities in America. And what you see is that levels of segregation persist in Milwaukee, Gary, Detroit, Newark, and New York. And in these major black communities in Provo, Utah, Boulder, Colorado, Fort Collins, Grand Junction, Colorado, and Missoula, Montana, levels of segregation have dramatically declined. And this reflects a change in racial attitudes in the United States. If you look at public opinion polls from the early 1960s, large majorities of white Americans believed that in segregation as a matter of principle. Large majorities said blacks should be segregated in school. Large majorities said blacks should be relegated to the back of the bus. Large majorities said white people have a right to keep black people out of their neighborhood. And that was the consensus, not simply in the South, but in the nation as a whole. The civil rights era comes in the 60s and changes racial attitudes. And by the 1980s, these people supporting segregation in principle drops to single digits. So very few people today admit to wanting to segregate as a matter of principle. However, the same opinion polls and surveys show that whites still harbor a number of powerful anti-black stereotypes. And because they harbor these anti-black stereotypes and sentiments, they are very reluctant to share residential space with them in practice. And what this means is that in places with small black populations, you can honor your commitment to principled integration and still not have to live with many black people. So you can desegregate Tucson, Arizona, which is about 3% black. And if you totally desegregate Tucson, Arizona, every neighborhood is 3% black. And that's okay. But you can't do that in Chicago, you can't do that in Detroit, you can't do that in Milwaukee, where the metropolitan area is about 25 or 30% black. So if you desegregate Milwaukee, you are going to be living around a lot of black people. And so there's been some improvement in attitudes, but in fact, white tolerance for black neighbors is really rather thin. I have just developed a model for measuring white tolerance for minority neighbors, and these are tolerance curves that show how tolerance varies across metropolitan areas as the minority proportion goes from 0 to 1.0. So you see that everybody starts at about the same point. Blacks are the solid black line, Hispanics are the dashed line, and Asians are the dotted line. So when there are very few of any group, people are fairly tolerant. It doesn't matter. But once the proportion of minorities starts to grow, tolerance falls. And it falls very rapidly, especially for African Americans. Less so for Hispanics, and even less so for Asians. And then at some point, when the African Americans or the minority group becomes fairly numerous, people start to adapt, and tolerance increases and goes back up. For African Americans and the other groups, the tolerance curve basically goes straight down till about 25 or 30%, and then it starts to rise. But most metropolitan areas, 90% of all metropolitan areas are less than 25 or 30% black, and there are very few above that. And so most African Americans experience very limited tolerance. And this is why you get that picture with Asians being the most integrated, Hispanics somewhere in between, and blacks being the most segregated and most spatially isolated. So tolerance is limited. And so one of the things I've sought to do is to study what drives segregation in the world today. In the past, it was open discrimination, openly discriminatory policies, private discrimination institutionalized throughout the real estate and banking industries. Now, open discrimination has not disappeared, but has gone underground, so it's very difficult to observe. But as the events in Charlottesville suggest, racial prejudice hasn't disappeared. And so I sought to develop an index that I could use and measure across metropolitan areas to assess the degree of anti-Black and anti-Latino prejudice in different metropolitan areas and see how that related to the level of observed segregation between Blacks and whites and between Hispanics and whites. So I borrowed an idea from an economist who was studying at Harvard University. And he was studying who voted and who didn't vote for Obama in the 2008 election. And he was working at Google Trends. He's a big data guy. And he looked at search frequencies on the N-word. And he found that it varied widely by different geographic regions. And when he broke it down by congressional district and voting district, he found that the higher the search frequency, the lower the vote for Obama. And so I thought this was a good idea. We've always had a hard time measuring prejudice because people don't like to admit their prejudice. And even on national surveys, you only have a survey of 2,000 people, and you can't use that to develop measures in 287 metropolitan areas. But with Google Trends, I could do that. So I got on Google Trends, and I did my own search frequencies on the N-word. And then I looked at where they were. And this is the geographic distribution. As you can see, red is high frequencies, and green is low frequencies with yellow in between. As you can see, prejudice really is strongly correlated with location in the east, in the south, in the Black Belt, in the Northeast, and the Midwest, especially the industrial Midwest. Those are the areas with the highest anti-Black prejudice as measured by frequency of searches on the N-word. And the West Coast is much less discriminatory or prejudice. And when you do an overlay, this is the level of segregation, you see that there's a strong correspondence. Places where are red, dark red here, tend to be dark blue here. Now, I went to Asians, and I couldn't get anything for Asians. But when I went to Hispanics, and I tried a bunch of derogatory terms for Hispanic, beaner and spick and whatnot, I didn't get anything. But when I looked at variations on the term illegal alien, that lit up the screen. And so here are search frequencies on the term illegal alien. And you can see that the highest level is in Arizona, specifically in Maricopa County, Arizona, where Sheriff Joe Arpaio rose to political prominence by mass arrests of Latinos and search for undocumented migrants. And he built concentration camps in the parks in the middle of Phoenix and dressed his prisoners in pink shorts and pink handcuffs and marched them down the main street of Phoenix every week in front of the TV cameras. And you can see somewhat of a correspondence, but it's not quite as strong as you saw for Blacks in the N-word frequencies. It's somewhat different here. So there's the concentration in the West, and you don't really see that much. And you see a lot of segregation of Latinos in the Northeast in particular. And this requires a little explaining, and that is that in the Northeast, in all regions of the country, the Latino population is dominated by Mexicans and Central Americans, except in the Northeast. In the Northeast, there's no single group that dominates, and it's a mixture of different kinds of groups. But in the Northeast, the predominant origin for Latinos is the Caribbean region, which is an Afro-Caribbean region. And in Caribbean, Latinos tend to be blends of European, indigenous, and African origins. And many are very dark-skinned and very African-looking. And so when I've, in separate analyses, I've looked at the percentage of Black and mixed race and white among Latinos, I find that the percentage non-white among the Latino population strongly predicts the degree of segregation in the Northeast. And if you break the data down and look at white Latinos, mixed Latinos, and black Latinos, you find that black Latinos are about as segregated as black Americans. Mixed race are much higher than white Latinos, but closer to blacks, and the white Latinos look more or less like other European ethnic groups. So in the Northeast, it's very much, in addition to, it's less about antagonism towards illegal aliens and more about race. So this is a complicated model. I probably can't see most of it, but I'll go through and tell you what it shows. This is a model I estimated to predict the level of segregation observed for different groups across different metropolitan areas. And the important findings are highlighted in yellow. And you can see that the anti-black index is a very powerful predictor of black segregation in the year 2000. The stars mean it's a very powerful and significant predictor. And the anti-Latino index, which I just described, is a very powerful predictor of Latino segregation. Density zoning has also emerged as an important cause of segregation. Prior to the Civil Rights Acts and prior to 1970, density zoning wasn't very well spread around US metropolitan areas. But by the year 2010, most suburbs around central cities, many suburbs around central cities have very restrictive density zoning regimes. They don't allow multifamily dwellings. They don't allow high levels of density. They only want large houses on single lots. And what I found in work with one of my graduate students is that high levels of restrictive density zoning strongly predict both racial and class segregation. By driving up the cost of housing in suburban areas and creating a lack of affordable housing, the poorer minority populations and poor populations in general are forced into central cities where housing is cheaper. And so you can see that here, the more permissive the density zoning regime in the suburbs surrounding a metropolitan area, the less segregated it is with respect to race. Minority composition. I've already explained to you why the black proportion is related to segregation. Where there are very few blacks, integration can happen, and people can adhere to their principles without yielding to their negative stereotypes and sentiments. Socioeconomic status. It does predict lower segregation. The higher the level of minority socioeconomic status, the lower level of segregation. But that by itself doesn't explain what's going on. It's not completely a function of, as I showed, when you control for income, blacks still stay very highly segregated, although it does decline as income rises. Large cities, large metropolitan areas are very likely to be most segregated. So it's Chicago, it's New York, it's Cleveland, it's Detroit. It's not the smaller metropolitan areas. The percent foreign born is associated with higher levels of segregation. As immigrants come in, they tend to cluster, and that produces levels of segregation. And finally, the last two ones might seem a little odd to you, but the size of the military population is negatively related to segregation. And that is because the United States military is the most successfully integrated institution in American life. It was desegregated by Harry Truman in 1948. And it's a command economy. The commander-in-chief orders you to stop being racist and stop discriminating, and you do that. If you don't get promoted up the ranks. And by the time, there was still a lot of residual discrimination going on in the Vietnam War, but after the Vietnam War, they pretty much cleaned up their act. And the US military is the only place, the only institution in American life where black people routinely boss around white people. And places with large military bases you can see the effect on the patterns of segregation. Military bases are not segregated on the basis of race. And so if there's a large military base in an area, it's going to affect the overall level of segregation. And we also see that off-base, it carries over, and it promotes integration off-base as well as on-base. And finally, the last one predicting there is the median year of housing construction. And that's all about the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. So if you're in an older metropolitan area with a lot of pre-1968 housing and not much has been built since then, you end up with high levels of segregation. Places in the south, the southeast, and the west, the southwest and the west, in the Pacific area, those places have boomed, and most of the housing is built after 70. So they've been covered by civil rights laws since they were built. But in places like Milwaukee or Philadelphia, a lot of the housing was segregated before 1970, and it takes time for that to change. So segregation in the United States is not something that's just a holdover from the past. It's something actively produced in American metropolitan areas today, actively produced by specific combinations of characteristics: high levels, residual levels of anti-black sentiment, low levels of black socioeconomic status, rigid restrictive density zoning in suburbs that prevents construction of multifamily housing, older housing stocks, large population size, and presence or absence of a military base. So these are the things that really drive levels of segregation today. Finally, I just want to conclude by talking about segregation and the concentration of poverty. This curve shows what happens as you move to the concentration of affluence, the degree to which affluent people live around other affluent people, as you move segregation levels, black-white segregation levels upward, and simultaneously move income upwards. So as average income increases, as the percentage affluent in a population increases, and as segregation increases, white affluence becomes more and more concentrated. Black affluence does too, as the percentage of affluent in a metropolitan area increases, but they don't concentrate nearly as much. And here you see the flip. In segregated metropolitan areas, as you increase the degree of affluence, along with segregation, black concentrations of poverty reach extreme levels. And whites, even at the same level of poverty, because of racial segregation, protects the white population, and they experience lower concentrations of poverty. And so what you get is a very unequal economic geography. These bars show the distribution of neighborhood disadvantaged, where the right is very high disadvantage and the left is low disadvantage. And the white bars are for white neighborhoods and for neighborhoods where average white people live, and the black bars are the average income and the degree of disadvantage in where average black people live. You see that the two distributions hardly overlap. Most black people don't live in high advantage areas, and white people never live in the most advantage areas. And this looks at the same thing just with simple income, black income. So per capita income, you see the black box there, and then that's the white distribution. You transfer that box over there, you see most whites are outside the box where almost all blacks live. And that's why neighborhoods have become the nexus of transmission of stratification, transferring both opportunities and disadvantages. The reason.
Mind going back to that, to your vote that, excuse me, I'm interrupting you.
So these are low disadvantaged neighborhoods. Those are the frequency of whites living in them by the degree of disadvantage. It's a score that combines a lot of socioeconomic characteristics. And then you see the black degree of disadvantage rises. By the time you get out to the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, there are hardly any whites present. And down here, where you get the most advantaged neighborhoods, there are hardly any blacks present. And there's very little overlap in between. We live in two different social worlds. And that is one of the starkest realities in American society. So what I have here is the percentage of affluent people living in the neighborhood of the average white resident. And you see areas of high concentrated affluence in the Northeast, large metropolitan areas in the West Coast. And you don't really see any neighborhoods where white affluence is not concentrated. The only place is Gary, Indiana. And here you do the same thing for affluent black people. And you see that their areas of concentrated affluence are much fewer and far between. And there are areas where affluent people live under rather shabby circumstances. And this is the opposite end of the spectrum. This is the percent poor in the neighborhood of the average poor white resident. And you see that there's no red, where poverty rates in the neighborhood where they live are above 40%. And there's some green, some yellow, 20 to 40%, but a lot of green, low poverty neighborhoods. So poor white people tend to live in not very poor places. This is the plot for African Americans. Poor blacks in these red areas live in neighborhoods that are at least 40% poor, something that never happens for white people. And some neighborhoods, this is an average across metropolitan areas, in some neighborhoods it's 60, 70, 80% poor, which you never observe for white Americans. And so what we've evolved, given the two things that have happened in American society over the past several decades, that is rising income inequality accompanied by rising class segregation in the context of continuing racial segregation. And in many ways, I didn't talk about it much, but the increasing segregation of Latinos. We've created two different environments, two different social worlds, where whites and Asians enjoy tremendous benefits and are separated from the problems of today. And another social world increasingly inhabited by blacks and Latinos, where high levels of disadvantage are experienced on a neighborhood basis. And just to conclude, I made a list of the place where affluent people, and particularly affluent white people, are most isolated from other classes and races. So affluent white people are most isolated and least likely to come into contact with people that are below them in the socioeconomic hierarchy. That the place where they're most isolated is Washington, D.C., which tells you something about the country we live in. The average white and Asian person in Washington, D.C. lives in a neighborhood that's 68% affluent, which is an extremely high concentration of affluence. And I really don't have time to go into all the details of these kinds of analyses, but basically what's happened over the past 4 decades is that class-diverse neighborhoods have decreased. Racially diverse neighborhoods have increased a little bit, but the big thing that's happened is that concentrations of affluence at the top and concentrations of poverty at the bottom have become more extreme. And as I pointed out, people have focused too much on the concentration of poverty, which is a bad thing. But what really changed over time was the concentration of affluence and the increasing isolation of the elite of the United States from the social circumstances that most Americans live under. And that will be the subject of American Apartheid 2.1 when I get time to finish it. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer some questions. Any questions? Yeah, back.
I'm wondering if you could just tell us what the 5 dimensions of poverty you mentioned if you can.
5 dimensions of segregation.
Yes.
So there's evenness, which is the degree to which two groups are distributed evenly across neighborhoods. So, for example, if a metropolitan area is 5% black and 95% white, then an even residential distribution, every neighborhood would be 5% black and 95% white. And that would give you an index of 0. And then in the most segregated circumstances, there wouldn't be any neighborhood where blacks live and whites also live, and vice versa. The next dimension is concentration. The next dimension is isolation. And that's the isolation index I gave you before. It's the percentage of own group members living in the neighborhood of your group. So if you're Hispanic, it's the percentage of Hispanics living in your on the neighborhood of the average Hispanic resident of a metropolitan area. Then there's clustering. It's the degree to which neighborhoods inhabited by minority groups cluster together in space or are spread out like a checkerboard across a metropolitan area. So if it's all one big homogeneous black ghetto at the center, that's a high level of clustering. Then we also have concentration, which is just the physical amount of space that a minority group inhabits. So the tighter and the more constricted the total amount of space, the more concentrated. And finally, there's centralization. That's the degree to which a group is located in towards the center of the metropolitan area instead of scattered towards the periphery. And African Americans, when we looked at the data in 1980, were the only group where all five, at least 4 of the 5 indices, but often all 5 of the indices were at very high levels above 6, on a 0 to 100 scale above 60 across all dimensions. And there were no Hispanic neighborhoods we observed where this happened, no metropolitan areas where this happened. But by the year 2000, we discovered that Latinos had become hyper-segregated in Los Angeles and in New York. So, and there are some other smaller metropolitan areas containing mainly Caribbean Hispanics, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans in the Northeast where hyper-segregation also prevails. So, and Asians nowhere.
In the 5 most segregated cities that you mentioned, is there also a correlation with the percentage of incarcerated people in terms of race?
Yes. The point I made about how segregation makes exclusion and discrimination simple and efficient. If you want to set up a mass incarceration system and a prison industrial complex, and you want to channel one set of people into it, and those people happen to be black, then you go to black neighborhoods. So black neighborhoods are over-patrolled and disproportionately contribute to the prison population. And then, of course, this has become another vector for stratification, because when people come back from prison, they come back into these communities as well. And for most populations, HIV/AIDS has very low rates among women, but among African Americans, the rate among women is actually quite high, and that's because the prison pipeline, people go into the prisons and they get exposed to HIV, and they come back and infect partners. And it's a real serious public health problem. So yeah, it dovetailed with the war on drugs and the war on crime and the rise of the carceral state that occurred in the 1980s and 1990s and disproportionately affected black communities. So stop and frisk is not something that happens to people in Darien, Connecticut, but it happens to people in the Bronx, Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, all the time. Yes? Yeah?
Yeah, I'm a child of the 60s. I went to high school, graduated in 63, in Philadelphia suburb. Did a hitch in the Navy. The high school and the Navy obviously were integrated entities. And we attended class together, played football, had teammates, and the Navy had shipmates. Until it was time to go home or it was time for liberty. And at that point, an absolute separation of groups. You didn't go on liberty with a black guy. You didn't go to a black schoolmate's house. You didn't go to a party. They didn't come to ours. There was very, very little. And I'm thinking, it wasn't the result of our being trained not to do that. It seemed to be.
Well, it's a result of high levels of prejudice prevailing in society. And there were pockets of integration, but they were few and far between. The military was most successful. In the 60s was quite early, so it's much more integrated now. But one thing we know that breaks down prejudice is intergroup contact on an equal status basis. And segregation makes that very difficult to happen. And so, I mean, I grew up in Olympia, Washington, which had one black resident who was a blind guy who lived in a hotel downtown, and he tuned everybody's pianos in town. And there wasn't another black family in Olympia, Washington, which is the state capital, until I was in junior high school. And the only time I saw black people was on 4th of July when an Army troop would come down from Fort Lewis to march in the parade. And that's the world I lived in. And it was a racist world. People used the N-word all the time. And they made jokes, and there were all these pernicious beliefs, and they were just part of daily life. And as late as like 1971 or 72, when I was in college and I was working construction in the summer, I'd work with these working class white guys, and every time they encounter a disappointment in life, they would rationalize by saying, well, at least I'm free, white, and single. Racism, sexism, misogyny, all in one clip statement. And so they knew they were experiencing white male privilege. There were entire job categories where there were no black people, no Latino people, no Asian people, and no women. And you could just count on it. And that world is going away. And there's a key phenomenon in psychology called loss aversion. Turns out that cognitively, psychologically, we hate to lose things. And the pain of loss is much greater than the thrill of gain. And so you earn $100, you're happy, but if you lose $100, you're really upset about it, comparatively. And so loss aversion is a very powerful motivator, and people fight to retain privileges that they had that they fear they're losing. I think that's a lot of what you're seeing in America today, because people in my generation, no older, we grew up in this world where white male privilege was institutionalized, and now it's no longer true. And men are just like falling by the wayside. When they had whole job categories set aside for them, they were doing fine. But now that they have to compete with women, they have to compete with black people, brown people, Asian people, and actually some of those people are ahead of them. It's tough for them to take. And I think that's a lot of what's driving the movement behind the white nationalism now. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you, Dr. Massey. Is it true that there's also been a growing ideological segregation in the United States? Is that something that you look at in your analysis?
Yeah, I have looked at that, and people call it the big sort, with liberal people moving into one place and conservative people moving into other places, and it's sorting out through migration patterns and also through the differential prosperity of different areas. So increasingly, liberal people live in different places than conservative people, and segregation on the basis of ideology and political affiliation has risen. And another interesting thing that people have discovered is that when people live in areas of concentrated affluence and they don't come into contact with poor people and they don't see poor people and they don't understand anything about poor people, they're much less generous. They contribute much less money as a proportion of their income than other people. And they have very different opinions. So the political opinions of the elite and everybody else have been going apart. So we've seen a real segmentation of American society on the basis of race, class, and income. Race, class, and family status, really. So that we've become a much more segmented society. And this has always occurred to some extent spatially, but now it's reinforced on the internet, and it's occurring virtually as well. So the content that people consume on the internet, and really any media, is vastly different depending on your race and your class and where you live.
Looking back and forward, is there ways in which we can change, effective ways in which we can?
There are ways. I think affordable housing initiatives and trying to combat restrictive density zoning and bring mix affordable housing more widely in society rather than concentrating it in certain places. New Jersey, across the river, has the Mount Laurel Doctrine, which states that no municipality in the state of New Jersey can write zoning laws that preclude the construction of affordable housing. And in fact, that each municipality has an obligation to allow for the fair share of the regional need for affordable housing. And that was decided in 1985. And about 60 or 70,000 housing units have been built, and it's been relatively successful in giving poor families access to much more advantaged neighborhoods. I wrote another book about, that was the Mount Laurel book, Climbing Mount Laurel, which is about what happened when the project that was the subject of the lawsuit finally opened in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. What happened to the Black and Latino families who moved in from places like Trenton and Camden and North Philadelphia and other poor areas? How did it affect them? And it gave them a huge step upward. So when Mount Laurel was being argued, all the local, not all, actually probably a small percentage of the local residents said, oh, this is going to cause property values to decline, crime rates to go up, tax burdens are going to increase. So we did a systematic analysis, and we found that there was no effect on tax burdens, no effect on property values, and no effect on crime rates. And then we said, okay, well, what's the effect on the people that got to move in? And so we did a systematic kind of quasi-experimental analysis where we compared people who moved into the project to people who had applied but were still on the waiting list. So they're both self-selected into the population of people who want to move into these advantaged circumstances. And the people who moved in have very quickly experienced lower rates of poverty, higher rates of earnings from work, higher rates of employment, much better mental health, much less exposure to disorder and violence, better school outcomes for their kids. And it was not without difficulties, because they moved into Mount Laurel, which is a white affluent suburb, and there's they get pulled over for driving while black, and they get followed in stores if they don't dress up a bit. But across the board, they were willing to put up with this in order to get access to the benefits of living in a low crime, low poverty, good educational system neighborhood. Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor. Over the summer, there were articles and materials on a section of Philadelphia called Suburbanization.
Uh-huh.
It's now becoming gentrification.
I know where it is.
What are your comments that you would like to share about such?
Well, that's part of our reorganization of urban space that's been going on over the past 20 years or so. In the 70s, when we started talking about gentrification, it was really on a household-by-household basis, like artists, gays, hippie types would move in, take over, buy a house or get into a house that needed fixing up, and they'd fix it up over time. And it was a small-scale thing. By the 1990s, this was being co-opted by large corporations and real estate developers. And it became a part of a real financial roller coaster that rolled over neighborhoods and transformed them. And you could see it very clearly what's happening in Philadelphia. Center City just keeps expanding outward, and what people call Center City keeps getting bigger and bigger. It's south of South Street, it's north of Spring Garden, and it's moving into Brewery Hill, edging up even towards Strawberry Mansion. And it displaces people, and the problem is it's good to bring people in with resources, but you have to figure out a way to keep other things affordable for other people to enjoy the upgrading of the neighborhood. And developers aren't interested in that. You need somebody in government to say, okay, you can develop here, but if you develop here, the price you pay is you have to set aside 20% of the units for affordable housing. And that's not being done. Where it is being done, is in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is the affluent part, suburbs of Washington, D.C. They've got set-aside programs there, and it's having an impact and allowing some people to remain, and even some people, even in places that aren't gentrifying but are just wealthy, when they build, they have to set aside affordable units. And it gives people access to better schools and better neighborhoods and more abundant resources. So gentrification, when it's just turned over to the private sector for strictly profit motives, it really ends up displacing poor people. And many of these neighborhoods are close-in neighborhoods on good transportation routes, and they end up being displaced elsewhere, often to suburbs, where there's not good transportation, and where there are even fewer resources, and property values are even more tenuous. So if you got a suburb without anything, but it's just a residential area, and property values start to go down, it becomes a spiral. But in the city, Philadelphia's still got all this infrastructure, all this wealth, all this jobs, universities, hospitals. But in Upper Darby, if things go downhill, it really puts a huge strain on things. So what we've seen is a shifting of poor and minority out of central city areas into more peripheral areas of the city and into suburbs, especially older inner ring suburbs. And this was exacerbated in places like Chicago with the Hope 6 housing program, where they tore down the old high-rise public housing projects, and then they said they were going to rebuild with lower density and create units for people locally, but somehow that just never happened. And they ended up displacing a lot of people to the southwest side suburbs, which were not in very good shape to begin with, and it really pushed them over the edge. And people in these suburbs are even more isolated because they're not on the elevated trains, they're not in the subways, and they're more vulnerable. One of my graduate students did her PhD dissertation and has written a book where she lived in what had been an integrated neighborhood, but was becoming a black neighborhood because of these things that are going on, the gentrification in central. It was outside of Pittsburgh, in central Pittsburgh, and they were moving out there, and then they didn't have access. They had a hard time getting jobs because they couldn't have access. The bus routes were not very good, and they were kept canceling the bus routes, and they just were getting more and more isolated. Even though it was a nice suburb built in the 1950s, but because of the concentration of affluence towards the center of the metropolitan areas now, and the peripheralization of poverty, you're getting a new configuration. And it really requires a lot of forceful public policy attention, and it's getting it in a few places, but not nearly enough. Yeah?
There's some literature about different religious traditions having different integration or segregation rates. Some say that Catholics, for instance, Catholic neighborhoods tend to segregate more slowly than Protestant neighborhoods, for instance. Are you seeing that as a continuing trend in your data?
Well, it's hard to do because you can't ask religion on the census. And all this is with census data analysis. You used to be able to look at it with the old ethnic neighborhoods. So Italian and Polish neighborhoods, you assume they're mostly a lot of Catholic. And then Russians were Jews. But back in the early post-war period, and even before, the Italian and Polish neighborhoods tended to be working class people who bought their bungalows, bought their homes. And Jewish neighborhoods were more dominated by renters with less of a stake. And so they were better able to move on out. And so they emptied out much faster than Catholic neighborhoods. And that seems to be a function of home ownership rates. But we can't really study it right now because you can't tell anybody's religion by their ethnicity much anymore, and you can't ask the question on the census. Are we done? Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.